The Texas sun beat down on my back as I knelt in the soil, my hands carefully working around the tender roots of my new tomato plants. Sweat dripped from my brow, but I didn't mind. This garden was more than just a hobby. It was my therapy, my sanctuary, my reason for getting up in the morning since returning from my last deployment. "Looking good, Sergeant," I muttered to myself, using the old rank that still felt more comfortable than Mr. Henderson. My left leg, permanently stiff from the IED that ended my military career, protested as I shifted position. The doctors had said gardening would be good physical therapy. They had no idea how much it would heal my mind, too. My little piece of paradise had taken 6 months to transform from the standard-issue suburban lawn into what it was becoming, a lush oasis of native Texas plants, vegetables, and a few special flowers that reminded me of my grandmother's garden back home. The HOA hadn't given me any trouble when I first moved in and submitted my landscaping plans. In fact, Brenda from the architectural committee had complimented my thoughtful approach to sustainable gardening. That was 3 months ago, before the election, before Margaret Peterson became HOA president. The distant sound of a leaf blower caught my attention. I looked up to see Margaret herself, power walking down the sidewalk in her pristine white tennis outfit, her perfectly coiffed hair unmoving in the breeze. She slowed as she approached my property, her eyes narrowing behind her oversized sunglasses. "Morning, Margaret," I called out, trying to keep my voice friendly. She stopped, hands on her hips. "David, we need to talk about this garden of yours." I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands onto my worn jeans. "Is there a problem?" "The problem is that it doesn't conform to our community standards." She gestured vaguely at my carefully planned beds. "It's messy, unstructured, not what we want representing our neighborhood." I felt my jaw tighten. "The architectural committee approved my plans. I have the email right here." "Plans change," she said with a dismissive wave. "The board has decided we need a more uniform look. I'm giving you 30 days to revert to standard landscaping." "Standard landscaping? You mean a patch of grass with 2 bushes? I couldn't keep the frustration out of my voice. This garden is therapy for me. It's how I'm managing my PTSD. Margaret's expression didn't soften. "Everyone has their challenges, David. The rules apply to everyone. 30 days. She turned and continued her power. Walk without another word. I stood there, watching her go, my hands clenching and unclenching. This garden was the one thing keeping me grounded since returning from Afghanistan. The one place where the nightmares and anxiety faded away. And now this woman, this HOA Karen with too much time and power on her hands, wanted to take it away. What would you do if your HOA tried to destroy your sanctuary? Would you fight back or comply? Let me know in the comments below. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of anxiety and determination. I spent hours researching HOA laws in Texas, printing out documents, and trying to schedule a meeting with the board. Margaret ignored my requests, while other board members suddenly became too busy to discuss my situation. Meanwhile, my garden flourished. The Texas heat was intense, but I designed everything to withstand it. Native plants thrived, vegetables swelled on their vines, and my pride grew with each new bloom. My neighbor, Elena, an elderly widow who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built, stopped by one evening with a pitcher of iced tea. "You've got quite the green thumb," she said, admiring a row of zinnias that had just opened. "Thanks, Elena. It's been my saving grace." She sat on the small bench I'd built beside my raised beds. "Margaret's been talking about you at the community meetings. She's got it in for you, you know." "I'm getting that impression," I admitted, accepting a glass of tea. "It's not just you," Elena continued, lowering her voice. "Since she became president, she's been on a power trip. Fined the Johnsons for their basketball hoop being an inch too high. Made the Martins remove their wind chimes. Even tried to tell me my birdbath was a standing water hazard." I shook my head. "Why does no one stand up to her?" "Most people don't want the trouble," Elena said. "She can make life miserable. But you're different. You've got that military determination in your eyes." I smiled faintly. "Once a soldier, always a soldier, I guess." Elena patted my arm. "Just be careful, David. Margaret plays dirty. I've seen her ruin people over less." Her words proved prophetic. 3 days later, I found an official-looking letter taped to my front door. It was a violation notice citing non-compliant landscaping and giving me 7 days to remediate the situation or face fines of $100 per day. That evening, I sat on my back porch, watching the fireflies emerge as dusk settled over my garden. The gentle sound of wind chimes I'd hung from the pergola mingled with the chirping of crickets. This peace was what I fought for overseas. This was my American dream, and Margaret Peterson wanted to destroy it. I pulled out my phone and searched for HOA revenge stories and how to fight HOA, looking for inspiration. What I found were dozens of tales just like mine, homeowners battling overzealous HOA boards, some winning, some losing. But none of them felt quite right for my situation. As I sat there, an idea began to form. Something subtle, something legal, but something that would make Margaret regret ever messing with a disabled veteran's garden. The next morning, I went to the local nursery with a specific plant in mind. Something beautiful, something allowed by the HOA rules, but something with a secret weapon that would eventually cause problems for the very people who destroyed my sanctuary. Have you ever faced an HOA injustice? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you handled it. The 7-day deadline came and went. I'd made no changes to my garden, except for adding the new plants I'd purchased at the nursery. They looked innocent enough, tall, graceful, with attractive foliage that would complement my existing design. On the 8th day, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery outside my bedroom window. My heart raced as I pulled on my jeans and hurried to the front door. There, in my front yard, was a landscaping crew with a small bulldozer. Margaret stood supervising, dressed in a crisp linen suit as if she were presiding over a corporate takeover rather than the destruction of a man's therapy garden. "What is this?" I demanded, storming outside. "Enforcement of the HOA rules, David," Margaret said coolly. "You were given ample opportunity to comply. You can't just come onto my property and destroy my garden. That's illegal." Margaret handed me a folded piece of paper. "Read it and weep. It's all right here in the HOA bylaws. Section 7.4 gives the board authority to remedy violations at the homeowner's expense if they fail to comply within the specified time frame." I scanned the document, my hands shaking with rage. She was right, the clause was there, buried in pages of legal jargon, but it had never been used in the history of the neighborhood, according to Elena. "This is my therapy garden," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I'm a disabled veteran. This garden is how I manage my PTSD." "Everyone has their crosses to bear," Margaret replied without a hint of sympathy. "The rules apply to everyone." I stood there, helpless, as the bulldozer's blade lowered and began ripping through months of careful work. Tomato plants I'd nurtured from seed, flowers that reminded me of my grandmother, herbs I used in cooking to help with my anxiety. All torn up, mixed with soil, and left in a ruined heap. The crew worked efficiently, destroying in 10 minutes what had taken me 6 months to create. When they finished, my front yard was a patch of bare earth, with only the new bamboo plants I'd recently added standing untouched in the far corner. "Why didn't you remove those?" I asked, pointing to the bamboo. Margaret glanced at them. "Those are fine. They're on the approved plant list. Very tidy." The rest was an eyesore. The crew packed up their equipment and left, leaving me standing in the ruins of my sanctuary. Margaret followed them, pausing only to hand me an invoice for $250 for the remediation services. "You have 30 days to pay," she said, "or we'll place a lien on your property." As she walked away, I noticed something that almost made me smile. The bamboo I'd planted, running bamboo, specifically, was already sending out small runners beneath the soil. Margaret had no idea what she'd allowed to remain in my garden. She thought she'd won. She had no idea this war had just begun. What would you do in this situation? Would you pay the fine and move on? Or would you fight back? Vote in the poll below. The next few weeks were a study in patience and planning. I paid the $250 fine using my disability check, money that should have gone toward new medical equipment I needed. Every time I thought about that, my anger burned a little brighter. But I didn't act rashly. My military training had taught me the value of intelligence and strategy. Before I made my move, I needed to understand my enemy and the battlefield. I started spending more time with Elena, listening to her stories about the neighborhood's history and Margaret's rise to power within the HOA. She moved here about 5 years ago, Elena told me over coffee one morning. Her husband's some big-shot lawyer. They bought the biggest house on the cul-de-sac, and immediately she started getting involved in the HOA. Has she always been this intense? I asked. Elena nodded. She started small, complaining about trash cans being left out too long, that sort of thing. Then she got on the architectural committee, then became vice president. When old Mr. Henderson passed away last year, she slid right into the president position without anyone really running against her. Why doesn't anyone oppose her? Most people don't care enough to get involved, Elena said. And those who do? Well, Margaret has ways of making life difficult for them. She knows all the rules and how to bend them to her will. I made a mental note of that. If she could bend rules, so could I. My next step was to attend an HOA meeting. I arrived early and sat in the back, observing. Margaret ran the meeting with military precision, her voice sharp and authoritative as she went through the agenda. Board members nodded along, rarely challenging her. Homeowners who spoke up were quickly shut down with references to bylaws they clearly didn't know as well as Margaret did. When the meeting ended, I approached a man who'd asked a question about parking restrictions and been thoroughly rebuffed. Tough crowd, I said. He sighed. Tell me about it. I'm Tom Wilson. I live on Oak Street. David Henderson. I'm the one whose garden got bulldozed. Tom's eyes widened. Oh man, I heard about that. That was rough. You seem to know your way around the HOA rules, I said. More than most of us. Tom smiled wryly. Necessity. My wife uses a wheelchair, and Margaret tried to fine us for our wheelchair ramp being not architecturally consistent. I spent 6 months fighting her on that. Did you win? Eventually. But it cost me time and money I didn't have. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. Look, if you're planning to fight back, be careful. Margaret plays dirty, and she's got the board wrapped around her little finger. I'm getting that impression, I said. Any advice? Know the rules better than she does. And find allies. You can't win this alone. I thanked Tom and walked home, my mind racing. As I approached my house, I noticed something that made me smile. The bamboo I'd planted was growing rapidly, its tall canes swaying gently in the breeze. Already, it was sending out runners beneath the soil, invisible but spreading. Margaret had destroyed my garden, but she'd left the one plant that would eventually cause her the most trouble. The irony wasn't lost on me. That evening, I sat down with my laptop and began researching everything I could about HOA laws in Texas, property rights, and bamboo. What I found was fascinating and exactly what I needed for my plan. Bamboo is remarkable. What appears to be a simple, attractive plant is actually one of nature's most efficient invaders. The variety I'd planted, Philostachys aurea, or golden bamboo, is particularly aggressive. It sends out underground runners called rhizomes that can travel dozens of feet from the original plant, popping up new shoots wherever they find suitable conditions. And bamboo rhizomes? They're strong. Strong enough to crack concrete, disrupt foundations, and destroy underground pipes. Perfect. According to my research, running bamboo wasn't specifically prohibited by our HOA rules. In fact, it was listed as an acceptable ornamental grass in the landscaping guidelines. Margaret herself had commented on how tidy it looked when she'd spared it during the destruction of my garden. What the HOA rules didn't mention, what most people don't know, is that bamboo needs to be contained with special barriers to prevent it from spreading. Without those barriers, it will eventually take over a yard and move into neighboring properties. And that's exactly what I was counting on. I spent the next few weeks nurturing my bamboo, watering it regularly, fertilizing it, and encouraging its growth. Meanwhile, I began documenting everything that had happened since Margaret became HOA president. I created a file on my computer. Emails between Margaret and myself about my garden, the violation notice she'd sent, the invoice for the remediation services, photos of my garden before and after the destruction, testimonies from Elena and Tom about Margaret's behavior with other homeowners, copies of the HOA bylaws with relevant sections highlighted. I also started attending more neighborhood functions, casually bringing up the HOA in conversations and listening to people's complaints. I wasn't the only one Margaret had targeted. Far from it. There was the young couple who'd been fined for their toddler's toys being left on the front lawn. The retired teacher who'd been ordered to remove a bird feeder because it attracted undesirable wildlife. The family who'd been told their American flag was too large and violated community standards. Each story added to my file. Each person became a potential ally. One afternoon, as I was checking on my bamboo's progress, Tom from the HOA meeting stopped by. "That's growing fast," he said, nodding at the bamboo. "I'm trying to create a privacy screen," I lied. "Since my garden was destroyed, I don't have much else out front." Tom studied me for a moment. "You know, running bamboo can be pretty invasive if it's not properly contained." I feigned surprise. "Really? The nursery didn't mention that. They just said it was on the HOA's approved plant list." Tom shook his head. "Of course they didn't mention it. Margaret probably put it on the list herself. She loves plants that look neat but require maintenance, which means more opportunities for her to find people." I filed that information away. "So what should I do?" "You can install a rhizome barrier," Tom said. "Special plastic that goes down about 3 feet around the planting area. Expensive, but it keeps the bamboo contained." "I'll look into that," I said, making a note to do exactly the opposite. As Tom walked away, I noticed something else. My bamboo was already sending shoots toward Margaret's house, which was 3 doors down from mine. The underground network was spreading, invisible, but determined. Just like my plan. 2 months passed. The bamboo flourished, growing tall and strong, its green cane swaying gracefully in the Texas breeze. From the street, it looked like an attractive, if somewhat unusual, landscaping feature. Margaret had even complimented it during one of her power walking sessions, saying it was finally starting to look presentable. If only she knew what was happening beneath the surface. The first sign of trouble appeared at the Johnson's house, which was between mine and Margaret's. Mr. Johnson cornered me one morning as I was getting my mail. "David, you know anything about plumbing?" he asked, looking frustrated. "Some. Why?" "We've got a leak somewhere in our front yard. Water bill shot up this month, and there's a damp spot that won't dry up." I followed him to his yard and looked at the area he indicated. Sure enough, there was a patch of marshy grass near their property line, closest to my house. "Weird," I said, trying to sound innocent. "Have you called a plumber?" "Yeah, coming out tomorrow." He shook his head. "Hope it's not something major. Those pipes are old." The next day, I happened to be working in my yard when the plumber arrived at the Johnsons. I kept an eye on their property while pretending to weed around my bamboo. After about an hour, the plumber emerged from digging a hole in the Johnsons' front yard. "Well?" Mr. Johnson asked. "Found the problem," the plumber said, holding up a section of pipe. It was cracked, with what looked like root damage. "Something's grown into your water line? Pretty aggressive, whatever it is." I had to turn away to hide my smile. The bamboo was working. A week later, similar problems emerged at the Smith's house, on the other side of mine. Then at the Garcias, across the street. Each time, the diagnosis was the same. Mysterious root damage to underground pipes. Margaret remained blissfully unaware, too busy issuing violation notices for improperly parked cars and trash cans left out a few hours too long. But her turn was coming. One morning, I was awakened by the sound of running water. Looking out my window, I saw a geyser erupting from the front yard of Margaret's house. Water sprayed high into the air, creating a rainbow in the morning sun. I grabbed my phone and started recording as Margaret came storming out of her house in her bathrobe, screaming at the water as if it were a personal enemy. Within hours, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the news. Margaret's main water line had burst, flooding her front yard and part of her house. The preliminary assessment? Root damage from an unknown source. I watched from my window as emergency crews worked to shut off the water and assess the damage. Margaret stood by, her face a mask of fury, barking orders into her phone. She had no idea this was just the beginning. Margaret's plumbing disaster was the talk of the neighborhood for days. Emergency crews had to dig up her front yard to replace the broken water line, creating a muddy mess that Margaret found absolutely mortifying. Absolutely unacceptable. I overheard her telling one of her board members during their emergency meeting at her house. This neighborhood's infrastructure is deteriorating. We need to raise HOA dues to pay for upgrades. I almost laughed out loud. The infrastructure wasn't the problem. Her precious manicured lawn was being invaded by my bamboo, and she had no idea. The following week, I received an official-looking letter from the HOA. It was a notice of a special meeting to discuss widespread plumbing issues throughout the community. Perfect. I arrived at the meeting early and took a seat in the back. The room was packed. Everyone who'd experienced plumbing problems was there, plus most of the neighborhood. Margaret stood at the front, looking flustered but trying to maintain control. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "As you know, we've experienced multiple plumbing failures in recent weeks. The board has hired an independent investigator to determine the cause." A man in a suit stood up and introduced himself as a civil engineer specializing in municipal infrastructure. "We've conducted a thorough investigation of the affected properties," he said, pointing to a map on the screen behind him. "The damage follows a specific pattern originating from this area here." He pointed directly to my house. Several people turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral. "The cause appears to be invasive plant roots that have grown into the underground pipes," the investigator continued. "Specifically, we've identified running bamboo as the source." Margaret's eyes widened as she made the connection. She turned to glare at me. "Running bamboo is on the HOA's approved plant list," I said calmly before she could speak. "I checked before planting it." The investigator nodded. "That may be true, but running bamboo requires special containment barriers to prevent it from spreading. Without those barriers, it can travel up to 30 feet underground in a single season." He clicked to the next slide, showing a diagram of how bamboo rhizomes spread through the neighborhood. As you can see, the bamboo has spread from the original planting site to multiple neighboring properties, causing extensive damage to underground utilities. The room erupted in murmurs. People began to realize that their plumbing problems weren't just random bad luck. Margaret stood up, her face red with anger. "This is unacceptable. Who planted this bamboo without proper containment?" All eyes turned to me again. "I did," I said, standing up. "And I followed all HOA guidelines. The bamboo is on the approved plant list. And there's no mention in the landscaping rules about special containment requirements. That's because no one ever thought someone would be irresponsible enough to plant running bamboo without barriers," Margaret snapped. "Is that in the rules?" I asked calmly. "Because I have the current landscaping guidelines right here, and there's no mention of bamboo containment." Margaret sputtered, unable to respond. The investigator intervened. "Regardless of who's at fault, the bamboo needs to be removed and all affected pipes replaced. The cost will be substantial." "How substantial?" someone asked. "Given the extent of the damage, we're looking at approximately 75, 0 to 100. 0 for the entire neighborhood." The room fell silent. That was a staggering amount, especially for a neighborhood of mostly retired residents and middle-class families. Margaret recovered first. "The HOA will cover these costs. That's what our reserve fund is for." A woman near the front spoke up. "Margaret, our reserve fund has only 50. 0. You know that. We'd need a special assessment to cover the rest." The murmurs grew louder. A special assessment meant every homeowner would have to pay extra to cover the damages. "Wait a minute," Tom Wilson said, standing up. "Are you saying we all have to pay because someone planted invasive bamboo that damaged our pipes?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Margaret replied, glaring at me. "And that someone will be held responsible." "For what?" I asked. "Following the HOA's own rules?" The argument escalated, with homeowners taking sides. Some blamed me, some blamed Margaret. Some blamed the HOA for not having proper regulations. In the chaos, I slipped out of the meeting. Phase 1 of my plan was complete. Now it was time for Phase 2. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. It was a demand for 100 to cover the cost of replacing all the damaged pipes, plus an additional 25 in penalties and legal fees. I laughed as I read it. They were actually trying to pin the entire cost on me. Perfect. I contacted a lawyer recommended by Tom Wilson, the same one who'd helped him with his wheelchair ramp case. Robert Chen specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. "They're trying to make you the scapegoat," Robert said after reviewing the letter. "But they've made a critical mistake." "What's that?" I asked. "They've admitted, through their own investigator, that the bamboo is on their approved plant list with no special containment requirements, and they destroyed your property without due process." I explained what had happened with my garden, showing Robert the photos and documentation I'd collected. "This is better than I could have hoped for," Robert said, a gleam in his eye. "Not only do you have a strong defense against their claim, but you have grounds for a substantial countersuit." Over the next few weeks, Robert and I prepared our response. We filed a formal countersuit against the HOA, citing 1. Destruction of property without due process. 2. Discrimination against a disabled veteran. 3. Failure to properly regulate landscaping materials. 4. Negligence in overseeing community infrastructure. 5. Emotional distress. We also requested copies of all HOA meeting minutes, financial records, and correspondence related to landscaping rules and enforcement. The response was swift and predictable. Margaret and the HOA board were furious. They began a smear campaign against me in the neighborhood, claiming I'd maliciously planted the bamboo knowing it would cause damage. But their tactics backfired. The more they attacked me, the more people started questioning Margaret's leadership. Homeowners who'd previously been afraid to speak up began sharing their own experiences with Margaret's heavy-handed rule. Elena became my unofficial campaign manager, organizing meetings and sharing information. Tom used his knowledge of HOA procedures to help us navigate the legal landscape. Even some of Margaret's former allies began to distance themselves from her. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was illuminating. We obtained emails showing that Margaret had personally added bamboo to the approved plant list without consulting any landscaping experts. We found financial records indicating that the HOA's reserve fund had been mismanaged under Margaret's leadership. And we uncovered meeting minutes where Margaret had discussed ways to encourage certain residents to move out by making their lives difficult. Most damning of all, we found a series of text messages between Margaret and the landscaping company she'd hired to destroy my garden, discussing how to make the destruction as thorough as possible to send a message to other homeowners. Armed with this evidence, Robert and I prepared for mediation. The HOA's attorney had contacted us, desperate to avoid a public trial that would expose Margaret's misconduct. The mediation was held in a neutral conference room at a local law firm. Margaret arrived with the HOA's attorney, looking confident and composed. I was there with Robert, who had a thick file of evidence in front of him. The mediator, a retired judge with decades of experience in property disputes, began by explaining the process. "The goal today is to reach a settlement that both parties can accept," she said. "This is not about winning or losing, but about finding a resolution that avoids the time and expense of a trial." Margaret's attorney spoke first. "My client, the HOA, is seeking $125,000 in damages caused by Mr. Henderson's negligent planting of invasive bamboo without proper containment. Additionally, we request that Mr. Henderson remove all bamboo from his property and pay for the installation of root barriers to prevent further spread." Robert held up a hand. "Before we discuss demands, let's establish some facts. First, the bamboo in question is on the HOA's own approved plant list. Second, there are no requirements in the HOA's landscaping guidelines for special containment of bamboo. Third, my client is a disabled veteran who was using his garden as therapy for PTSD, a garden that was destroyed by the HOA without proper due process." He paused, letting that sink in. "Furthermore, we have evidence that the HOA president, Margaret Peterson, personally added bamboo to the approved plant list without consulting any experts. We have evidence of her directing the destruction of my client's property in a manner designed to be punitive rather than remedial. And we have evidence of her discussing ways to encourage certain residents to move out of the neighborhood." Margaret's face paled. "That's taken out of context." "Is it?" Robert asked, sliding copies of the text messages across the table. "Because these messages seem pretty clear." The mediator reviewed the documents, her expression growing more serious. "Additionally," Robert continued, My client has documented numerous instances of the HOA under Margaret's leadership violating its own bylaws, targeting specific residents, and failing to maintain common areas properly. We believe this constitutes a pattern of harassment and mismanagement. The mediator looked at Margaret's attorney. How do you respond to these allegations? The attorney shifted uncomfortably. We acknowledge that there may have been some procedural irregularities. However, the fact remains that Mr. Henderson's bamboo has caused substantial damage to neighborhood infrastructure. Damage that could have been prevented if the HOA had proper landscaping guidelines, Robert countered. Damage that was exacerbated by the HOA's failure to maintain aging infrastructure. And damage that pales in comparison to the emotional distress caused to my client, a disabled veteran, when his therapy garden was destroyed. The mediation continued for hours, with both sides presenting their cases. Margaret grew increasingly flustered as Robert systematically dismantled her arguments with evidence of her own misconduct. Finally, the mediator called a break and spoke with each side privately. When we reconvened, she looked at Margaret. The HOA is in a very weak position here. The evidence of procedural violations and potential discrimination is substantial. A trial would likely result in a judgment against the HOA, possibly including punitive damages. Margaret's attorney nodded grimly. The mediator turned to me. However, the bamboo has caused legitimate damage to your neighbor's properties. While you may not be legally responsible, there is an ethical consideration here. I nodded. I understand. I never intended for my neighbors to suffer. My dispute was with Margaret and the HOA board, not with them. Good, the mediator said. Then I believe we can reach a settlement. The terms she proposed were: 1. The HOA would pay me $50, $0 in compensation for the destruction of my garden and emotional distress. 2. The HOA would cover the cost of repairing all damaged pipes, using their reserve fund and insurance. 3. I would remove the bamboo from my property at the HOA's expense. 4. Margaret Peterson would resign as HOA president and not seek any position on the board for 5 years. 5. The HOA would revise their landscaping guidelines to include proper regulations for potentially invasive plants. 6. Both parties would agree not to speak publicly about the dispute or disparage each other. Margaret's face was a mask of fury, but she knew she had no choice. Her attorney advised her to accept the terms. I looked at Robert, who nodded slightly. It was more than I had hoped for. I agree, I said. The settlement was signed, sealed, and delivered within a week. Margaret resigned as HOA president, issuing a brief statement about wanting to spend more time with family. The board elected Tom Wilson as interim president, and he immediately began working on revising the landscaping guidelines. A professional landscaping crew removed the bamboo from my property, taking care to extract all the rhizomes to prevent regrowth. The HOA paid for the removal and for repairing all the damage to my neighbor's properties. With part of my settlement money, I hired the same crew to rebuild my garden. This time, it was bigger and better than before, with raised beds, a small pond, and even a greenhouse for starting plants. I made sure to submit detailed plans to the new HOA board, which approved them without hesitation. The neighborhood changed after Margaret's departure. People who had been afraid to speak up began attending HOA meetings. New, more reasonable rules were put in place, and enforcement became fairer and more consistent. Elena became my regular garden companion, often stopping by with advice or just to sit and enjoy the peace. Tom and his wife invited me over for barbecues. Other neighbors who had previously kept their distance now waved and stopped to chat. One evening, as I was watering my vegetables, a woman I recognized as one of Margaret's former allies approached my fence. "David," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to apologize for how I treated you before, for believing Margaret's lies." I smiled. Water under the bridge. We all make mistakes. She nodded, looking relieved. "The neighborhood is so much nicer now, more friendly." "That's what happens when people treat each other with respect," I said. She left, and I turned back to my garden. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the plants, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. This garden was more than just plants and soil. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what's right, of fighting back against injustice without resorting to the same tactics used by those who wronged me. I had taken on an HOA Karen who abused her power, and I had won. Not with brute force or underhanded tactics, but with patience, strategy, and a thorough understanding of the rules. As darkness fell, I sat on my bench and listened to the gentle sound of wind chimes. This was my sanctuary, my therapy, my small piece of paradise, and no one would ever take it away from me again. What would you do if your HOA tried to fine you for living your life? Would you fight back or comply? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you faced HOA injustice of your own, I'd love to hear your story. Together, we can help others understand their rights and stand up to unfair treatment. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is living well and following the rules better than your opponents do.